Pastor Cameron Martin, and this is The Pursuit. This week we're going to flash back and touch back on something that we alluded to or got close to but didn't go too deep into a couple of weeks ago. Also, to start, I recently posted a quote from Pastor Bill Johnson. He's said this many times, and so depending on where you see it or hear it, it differs slightly. But basically he says, I don't think Satan cares which cause you champion, as long as you leave behind the character of Christ to defend it. Here's the thing. We are always in a battle, not with flesh and blood. In Ephesians 6:12, Paul says, we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against rulers, evil rulers, and authorities in the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. If this is true, that would mean we could never direct any ammunition toward anyone we can see. While we wage our spiritual battle, we also fight against our own flesh and our feelings. When we react to other people being enlisted by our spiritual enemy. So we, in the natural, do have a real battle and a response, but it's against us. So the only flesh we can really see and also battle is us. Because otherwise, if we're looking at someone else, then we should be addressing the spirit behind what they're doing and what it's appearing to be in the flesh. With that said, I'm always surprised how quickly we forget this idea. We see a post, a meme, a question, or a statement. We hear a comment or watch a video, and immediately we feel the need to reply or respond. How likely is it that the feeling I'm describing is Jesus calling you to alert in defending him and his cause? Let me ask that again. How likely is it that the feeling I described when we read or see something and feel like we have to respond, how likely is it that that feeling is Jesus and him calling you to defend him and his cause? How often does the Spirit of God inside us spring into action and address something we encounter secondhand? I tend toward the idea that the Spirit of God responds more often when we witness something that he desires to address in person. I say that because if we look in Matthew 9, starting in verse 35, we read this. Jesus traveled, first off, all through the towns and villages of that area, teaching in the synagogues and announcing the good news about the kingdom. He healed every kind of disease and illness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. He said to his disciples, the harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest and ask him to send more workers into his fields. So Jesus knew there were confused and helpless people who needed healing and direction, but he went beyond knowing and beyond even praying to going and witnessing those very people and their plight firsthand. Then we see compassion well up inside him and move him to action, to ministry. It also moved him to send us. He didn't in the end there, it says, he said to his disciples, the harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest and ask him to send more workers into the field. He didn't say, pray for those people to be enlightened and pray for those people to be healed or that they would be helped or that they would be less confused and informed and maybe directed. He said, pray that someone will go to them. Because when we see people in their plight, in their confusion, then we're moved with compassion to respond. If we respond before we're moved with compassion, we are responding in a different spirit. And it's usually not the Spirit of God, is what I'm saying. We have to go and see, and then the Spirit of God is stirred up inside us. It's the Spirit of Jesus who saw those very people and then responded. That same Spirit lives within us, and when we see it, that same Spirit is stirred up in the same way and responds in a similar way at least, and heals and directs and removes confusion. And that's what we go to deliver. That's how we minister. We administer what we've been given to the hurt and the wounded and the sick. So now he gets to witness us respond to the broken people that he loves, that we know are in need of healing and direction, but he sees us respond when we do it online and not go in person. He sees us respond with contempt instead of compassion. So we're not moved to ministry, but mockery. This message today that you're hearing is not about solving the issues in which we encounter others. It's how we choose to behave when we encounter them. And we've talked about this a little bit before. We talked about securing peace and maintaining peace and establishing peace. But we're going a little deeper today into just how we can manage to do that well. So this is about how we choose to behave when we encounter others in their situations, and while we wait to discover how Jesus wants to sort out their individual circumstances. Okay, so let's jump into now, and this is where we're spending the rest of our time. This is the part here. This is so important and so deep and helpful. I hope I can help deliver some of that today, Lord. Colossians 3, and we're going to spend the rest of our time in Colossians 3, 12 through 15. So I'm going to read it all and then we'll go back. So this is what Paul says to the church at Colossae. He says, since God chose you, to be the holy people that he loves, you must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds us all together in perfect harmony, and let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as members of one body, you are called to live in peace. Oh my goodness. That is so rich. So we start with this. God chose you. He didn't just choose you to feel love toward. He didn't just choose you to sacrifice himself. He chose you for those reasons and also chose you as part of the solution ongoing. We represent Jesus, and we do that by representing Jesus. So we don't just go with the label Christian on our hat or on our shirt. We go and we present him. I know I just said that and then said it a second time. We go and we present what he presented again. And we present to others what he has given us to show and display as ministry. In verse 15 of Colossians 3 there, we are told to let the peace that comes from Jesus rule our hearts. So if we go out, no matter where we are, if it's social media, if it's in person, if it's in text, if it's wherever it is, if that peace starts to be disturbed or leave, we have to let it win out, which means we have to retreat possibly from what we believe, not change what we believe, but let off the gas on trying to convey it in that moment. Because if it's not being conveyed in peace and in love, we're already losing. We're not representing Jesus. What we're doing is we're presenting his ideas and maybe something that he said, but we're doing it from our hurt and our insecurity, and that comes across differently. It's not carried the same. Because again, if our battle is not against flesh and blood, then we can't insert our flesh into it and expect the same result. So we've got to let the peace that comes from him, he gives us his peace. It's his very peace. And we've got to allow that to rule over what is coming out of us. We represent him, or we represent him by carrying peace into every situation. We are commanded to recognize and remain as one body. We're called to remember that we are all in this together, and that we are, as his representatives, we are maintaining his body. We have to remain one body while we work through hurts and disappointments and conflicts. So Jesus gives us his durable peace to equip us to encounter not others we already agree with, but those who are likely to disturb our flimsy peace. He gives us his durable peace to equip us to encounter others in those situations. So, God chose you. The second point is that Paul makes is make allowances for the faults of others. I get that we feel wronged and we feel slighted and we feel maybe even called to correct others and instruct them, and maybe we are. But what we have to remember here, what Paul is saying, is we're not just making allowances or giving people space to be themselves or be accidentally wrong. Paul is saying here, we have to make allowances for them to be at fault. We're so quick to assign blame, but what Jesus is saying through Paul here is that we have to actually plan ahead for when somebody else deserves to be blamed, that we've already accounted for that in our hearts with grace and forgiveness. So, in John 1:14, when we read that Jesus showed up, and this is the Word became flesh, when we read that Jesus showed up in the flesh, at that point, he was, in John 1:14, we read, full of truth and grace. We are supposed to represent him, but we are so quick to show up only with the truth. And I do that in air quotes the best I can, because we come up with what we believe is the truth at that point. But we're told specifically in Scripture that we know in part and we see in part. We don't know it all, period, here. So we always should be going in with some measure of humility, at least to the degree that we know that even though we are certain about some things, that we don't understand them completely. And it's possible whoever we're talking to understands more than we do, or understands part that we don't. So we're supposed to represent him, but we are too quick to show up with only what we think is the truth. Then we go passionately wild, making sure everyone knows that what we believe the truth is, and we wonder why we aren't marked by his peace. It's because we run away from grace when we choose to chase others down with the truth. We have to go in just like Jesus. He came in the flesh, and when we come in our flesh, which usually means we're hampered by it, when we come in, we have to make sure that we are full, that this flesh is full of his truth, him as the truth, and full of grace. In Colossians 3:13, we're commanded to, like I just said, make allowances for each other's faults. We should expect and be prepared with grace and truth to encounter others. That's what that means. When we make allowances, we're taking action ahead of time to create margin to operate within, so that when someone else shows up and they are wrong, it says for their faults, when they're wrong, that we are prepared with enough grace and enough forgiveness that we can manage and navigate that relationship, that friction, that even conflict, and come out still presenting Jesus. So we should expect and be prepared with grace and truth to encounter others, assuming ahead of time that we may not see things the same. So we make allowances and show up with grace, knowing the truth God wants to share, not us, is there, and we are ready to extend forgiveness. Verse 13 in Colossians 3:13 starts with make allowances for each other's faults, but it ends with he forgave you, so you must forgive. So remember that going in, not only is part of the making allowance being prepared to be patient and humble and showing kindness and listening to understand and not just to respond, that in the end, we have to also be prepared to forgive. And if we don't have a keen sense of how much we've been forgiven, or how bad the things we've actually done, or how much they deserved something other than forgiveness, but God decided to respond to us in forgiveness, if we don't have a real sense of that, we're going to go in somewhat arrogant and somewhat blind, sort of thinking to ourselves, well, I was never that bad, or I was never this stupid, and now I'm coming in to save you from being more stupid or wrong than I've ever been. Otherwise, we shortchange the grace we've been given from God that required him to forgive us. So he forgave us, so we must forgive. So we remember that God chose us to represent him, his character, and his message. We prepare before every encounter knowing the truth about ourselves as well as God's truth. And we accept responsibility to be full of not only truth, but grace, and ready to extend the same forgiveness that we enjoy. Then, what happens if we get riled up? I mean, because that's really what we're talking about today, is that we are going along on our happy, holy little cloud, and then somebody messes it up by making some statement or asking some question or posting something or saying something, and then something in us rises up and is feeling like something has to be done in that situation. So, what happens when we get riled up? What do we do when we just want to yell and type in caps? What we do is we clothe ourselves. We're still in that same bit here of Colossians 3:12 through 15. So we clothe ourselves. Verse 12 says, because God chose us, we clothe ourselves. We put something on over our flesh, something that he gives us. So that's saying he knew this was going to happen, and he gave us a toolbox. He gave us a knapsack, a backpack full of garments, full of clothing, basically, that goes on over our flesh. So our flesh can feel pain. It can have wounds. Our flesh can rise up and feel wronged. It can feel offended. It can feel angry. And he has given us something to put on over top of the anger and the offense and that feeling of needing to set somebody else straight. We put something on over our flesh that he gives us. Colossians 12 lists those things as mercy, kindness, humility, patience, gentleness, and love. So when we encounter someone lashing out at us from their wounds and their pain and are tempted to respond in kind, we put on mercy over top of the offense and the anger we feel. When we encounter someone who has become stuck and is wallowing in their bad fortune because they believe they're a victim and there is no hope and no help. And we are tempted to placate them with a quick fix or tough love or the perfect scripture. We put on kindness and gentleness over top of our annoyance and our assumption of what we might do if we were in their situation. When we encounter someone grandstanding and making sweeping know-it-all statements about whatever trending topic they happen to be an expert on this week, and we are tempted to put them in their place with a snarky meme or our pet piece of propaganda disguised as responsible and informative journalism, we put on humility over top of our arrogance and our superiority complex that tells us that we not only know the only possible correct answer, but that it is indisputably our place to restore balance to the internet by correcting them publicly. When we encounter someone who is once again taking too long to finish their sentence or retelling the same story or driving slowly in the fast lane, and we are tempted to tailgate them into submission, tell them what we think they mean, or mock them because they don't realize we've heard their story before. We put on patience over top of our short-tempered attempt to control others. We do all of this because if we are going to represent Jesus, we must love others while they do whatever it is they choose to do. Jesus loved us first. He chose to die for us while we were still sinners. And he forgave me and you for the many times we obliviously did all those things I just listed that we get so annoyed when somebody else does. Here's where God places us. If we even attempt to put on his attributes and prioritize the spiritual gifts he has given us to do what he has asked us to do, as we represent him to the world by prioritizing love and peace, he promises us unity and harmony, regardless of who is involved or what we're involved in. That is contending for more. So let's do it together at jointhepursuit.net. Hopefully, I'll see you there.